Every year, the BBC, the British Broadcasting Corporation, commissions an intellectual, whether that's a scientist, an author, a philosopher, what have you, to give a series of radio lectures that are then broadcasted internationally. This is a very prestigious event and one that gives whoever gets selected for that particular year access to a global audience overnight. In 1993, the person who was selected to give the Reed lectures was Edward Said, who is now mostly remembered for his work on literary theory, English literature, and Orientalism, this way of thinking about how the Orient has been constructed by the Western imaginary in literature, in philosophy, in politics, so on and so forth. Now, when he gave the 1993 lectures, the Reed lectures, Said decided to give them about the very figure of the intellectual. So here we have an intellectual, Edward Said, talking about the figure of the intellectual in a platform that is intentionally designed to give intellectuals access to a broad public. And so there's a kind of mise en abîme here happening of intellectuals talking about intellectuals in a space curated specifically for intellectuals. Now, I want to talk about these lectures, of which there are six. And these lectures, which were originally, again, given orally and they were broadcasted all over the world, later, they were transcribed and slightly expanded and published as a book called Representations of the Intellectual. And it is a really astute analysis of the figure of the intellectual, its origins in the 19th century, and the challenges faced by contemporary intellectuals trying to make their way, whether that be inside or outside the academy. Now, because there are six different lectures, there's a lot of content to talk about. We're talking about a whole book here once you transcribe it. And so, what I plan to do is just highlight three central ideas that come out in Said's analysis of the intellectual. Idea number one: the intellectual is a child of the 19th century. According to Said, although nowadays we're used to thinking that there are these people who are called intellectuals who form a group and they form a community and they share certain interests in common, that figure really did not exist previously. It's a relatively recent historical invention. And we see the birth of the intellectual in the 19th century, especially in literature. So, in the first of the Reed lectures, Said, who is an expert in literature, spends a lot of time talking about how in certain novels from the 19th and early 20th century, you start seeing the emergence of certain characters. They may not be professional intellectuals yet, since that figure does not yet exist, but they start exhibiting all the tendencies and the predilections and the propensities that nowadays we associate with the figure of the intellectual in a more professionalized sense. So, for example, he talks about novels such as James Joyce's The Portrait of an Artist as a Young Man, or Ivan Turgenev of Fathers and Sons, where he says there are always these characters that appear in the narrative who represent something like a new commitment to the idea of freedom of thought. So these are characters, typically men, and Said points out that there are virtually no representations of women intellectuals in this period. He says you have these characters, these male protagonists or sidekicks that play a certain role in the unfolding of the narrative precisely because they represent a new way of thinking about the world, according to which thinking about the world is a mode of experiencing the world. And so it's not as if these individuals simply represent somebody who has receded from the world into some kind of enclosed space of the mind, like a recluse or like a hermit. Rather, they are people who assert in their very identity and through their interactions with others that they engage the world by thinking about it. So thought itself no longer appears as some kind of hidden chamber of the mind that is separate from the world. It actually represents a way of dwelling in the world, a way of thinking and making sense of the world around us. And what's unique about these characters, again, that you see primarily in novels, in 19th century novels, is not just that they value thought and freedom of thought, but that if you were to think about their psychology and their commitments, freedom of thought starts sort of moving toward the very top of their ideals, such that many of these characters, and you see this in the way in which the narrative plays out, are willing to sacrifice a lot for the freedom of their thinking process. In other words, they're willing to end relationships, they're willing to make socially illegible decisions, they're willing to sometimes pay a very high price in order not to compromise the dignity and integrity of their ability to think about the world and to live their life with that thinking process as the lodestar. And so for him, the figure of the intellectual is born in the 19th century, and you see that birth primarily in the literary realm. Idea number two, the intellectual should strive to be an amateur. Now, that sounds somewhat counterintuitive, so let's work our way up to that conclusion. Now, Said points out that once the figure of the intellectual is born in the 19th century, again, as this defender of freedom of thought who lives their lives according to that principle, putting everything else second to it, once that figure is established socially and spreads throughout the social body, so that you have individuals who are intellectuals in science, in academia, in poetry, in politics, even in private industry. So once they spread everywhere, it becomes clear to a lot of scholars who write about this new figure, like sociologists, historians, even philosophers, that the intellectual is by nature a somewhat paradoxical character. They're paradoxical because in order to be intellectuals, they have to defend their own freedom of thought, they have to believe in freedom of thought. But at the same time, because of the way in which they exist in institutions like science, the party, the university, industry, the church, they also compromise their freedom of thought with their professional affiliations, with their institutional connections. So there is here a kind of tension between dependence on institutions and autonomy or self determination at the level of thinking. Now, for Said, this paradox means that there's always a series of dangers that are just lurking around the corner for intellectuals. And he notes that a lot of other people point out many dangers to the intellectuals, like, oh no, you shouldn't publish in mass media outlets because once you do that, you sell out, basically. Or you shouldn't make a lot of money as an intellectual because as soon as you sell out in that way by making a lot of money, then you're no longer really a trustworthy intellectual. And so people have all kinds of theories about what the dangers to intellectual life are. And Said says, although it is true that there are dangers all over the place, the real danger that we need to watch out for when it comes to intellectuals has to do really with specialization and professionalization. So, of course, an intellectual in some way has to be a professional and they have to have expertise, right? Intellectuals typically are clever people who have developed authority in a particular domain and who can speak intelligently and coherently about their subject matter. But the problem is that once an intellectual establishes themselves as a leader in a field, they actually start losing sight of culture more generally. More importantly, as you become a leader in your field, your political outlook can start changing without you realizing it, to the point that you start fetishizing leadership and leaders because you yourself are becoming one. So slowly, unconsciously, you start becoming a little bit authoritarian. Um, Also, specialization, according to Said, has this psychological ramification, which is that as you become more narrow and you become more regimented as a leader, expecting other people to do what you say by virtue of your authority, you actually start losing the excitement that originally got you into your area of inquiry. And so not only are you no longer enthused and excited about what's going on, but you start simply replicating the behavior of the past and you stop innovating. So, yes, you do have to specialize in order to be an intellectual, but then there is this danger that is intrinsic to specialization. And the same thing happens with just the relationship between expertise and power for Said, where, as you become a more established name in the field, you start getting tempted by those in positions of power with positions of power. You start thinking in terms of grants, you start thinking in terms of invitations to the big conference, you start thinking in terms of awards and prizes. And even in terms of like opportunities to collaborate with government or with private industry, they start creeping in to your way of thinking to the point that at some point you actually cannot guarantee the freedom of thought that is the defining feature of the intellectual. Now, Said points out that these dangers of specialization, expertise, and power can be combated by a reawakening of what he calls the spirit of the amateur. And again, that might seem counterintuitive because an amateur is kind of like a rando who doesn't have expertise necessarily. But that's not really what Said means. What Said means by the amateur is essentially somebody who approaches an object, whatever that object is, with, as he says, care and affection. So it is about still keeping alive that love for inquiry, that love for the object that originally motivated you to pursue the life of the mind, and that over time, with the logic of specialization and professionalization, started eroding away and disappearing from view. And so here, think about amateur not so much as not so much in terms of the absence of knowledge, but in terms of a certain way of thinking about my relationship to what I study. And of course, amateur comes from the same root as love, like amorous. So, one way of thinking about the amateur is somebody who is in love with a particular object of inquiry. One way in which he puts it is that an amateur is less likely to compromise for an audience or for a public, because what the amateur cares about is the object and not all these distractions that come with fame and with recognition. Idea number 3: politics should not be theology. When he talks about theology, what Said has in mind is a deification of political beliefs. So he's not saying that as an intellectual, you should not be religious. And in fact, he says there are a lot of individuals who pursue the life of the mind, either explicitly in connection to religion, like priests or clergymen, or simply who use religion as a way of motivating their political commitments. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. There is an important place for religion to play in civic and political life. And so when he says that politics should not become theology, he doesn't mean that we need to extract religion from the social field. Rather, he means that our relationship to our own political commitments should not become so rigid that our political principles become a new kind of God. And the reason that he talks about this is because he's worried that when you turn a religious ideal, I'm sorry, a political ideal, and push it all the way up to this theological register where it cannot be violated, not even once, you cannot compromise, you must fight for it at all times unconditionally, it actually sets you up for failure. And it leads to very weird acts of recantation that he says we saw happening on a large scale in the 1980s. So in the 1980s, there was this movement, this political movement on the conservative side of the American political spectrum called Second Thoughts. And it never really reached the status of a movement. So we're talking about something a little bit less intense than a movement. But there was this kind of trend in the 1980s that coincided with Reaganism in the US and with Thatcherism in England. And Second Thoughts was basically a series of authors who kept pushing this idea that a lot of intellectuals who were leftists in the 1960s with the spirit of 68, they may have been radicals, they may have been anarchists, they may have been feminist and anti-war, suddenly saw the light of conservatism in the 1980s and switched their political alliances. And so there were all these articles at the time of like such and such has had second thoughts about communism or has had second thoughts about the spirit of 68. And Said looks at that, at the second thoughts movement, and says, you know, this whole idea of a complete recantation as if like I was wrong before, I need to do a mea culpa in public and go the other way. People who do that are people who have deified their political ideals. They have set them up so high that the moment they don't actually reach them, they just throw everything on the ground. And from being leftist, suddenly they're right wing spokespeople. And he says the problem with those people is not that they changed their mind necessarily. The problem is that they couldn't possibly imagine tweaking their political worldview without just turning it inside and out or upside down entirely. So those kinds of recantations and mea culpas and confessions, public confessions of a change of faith, are actually symptoms of rigidity of thought, of a subject who is so inflexible that the moment one thing changes, they throw everything out. They throw out the baby with the bathwater. And so this is from the last lecture that Said gives, and he ends on a difficult note, a note that I'm calling difficult because I have some mixed feelings about it. And he says, those of us who identify as leftists in whatever way, in however you define that, we do want to believe in our political values, right? We want to believe in equality and justice and whatever other terms organize your interpretation of the left. But we don't want to embrace them in such a way that we turn them into objects of theological adoration or veneration. And that means that a leftist intellectual must always keep an open mind, even about their own leftist orientation or about particular aspects of their leftist worldview. And they must maintain a mind that is always open to the possibility of doubt. In other words, don't be too close minded, even about your own leftism. And that means, and this is the aspect that I think complicates things quite a bit, that every leftist intellectual must relate to their own worldview with a hint of irony. I will let you think about that, but for Said, there is a very subtle, very small element of sort of like an ironic wink that we have to do when we think about the worldview that we construct for ourselves and on the basis of which we embark on different political projects. Again, I typically leave my views out of these videos, but I found that really tricky. I don't yet know what I think about it. I'm not saying yay or nay, um, but it is an interesting way of thinking about the task of the intellectual. Now, let me conclude by saying something about how Said interprets the figure of the intellectual. He says very early on in the lectures that an intellectual is fundamentally somebody who represents. And that means representing maybe like a group of people. Like I am an intellectual for, I don't know, like the queer community. I represent a community. But also somebody who represents in the sense that their work, their task is to give representations of the world for that public. So not only are they representing that public, they are also representing the world to that public so that that public can interpret the world in a particular way. And that's why the title of these lectures, Representations of the Intellectual, actually has three layers of meaning. It's kind of like a triple threat all in one. It is about the intellectual who represents a group. It is about the intellectual who offers representations as their work, as their vocation. And it is also about representations of intellectuals in media, in philosophy, and in literature. But it does mean that for Said, to be an intellectual is fundamentally to represent.